Welcome to the History with Ali podcast, where we discuss all things history, literature, and media studies. I'm your host, Ali Harrison, and today I'm very happy to welcome Jennifer and Brown to the podcast. Jennifer is a scholar of medieval literature and currently serves as Dean of Art and Sciences at Bentley University. She has written several academic articles and books, and today we will be discussing her first novel, The Lost Book of Elizabeth Barton. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to finally speak to you after following you for quite a while.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a professor in English and Media Studies and the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Bentley University. My research and teaching specialty has been medieval women and medieval nuns and devotional literature. And I've published a lot on that subject. But I think we're here because of my novel, which is my newest. It was taking a little bit of a side turn that ended up becoming a bigger thing, called The Lost Book of Elizabeth Barton, which is about a real Tudor woman and drew on a lot of my academic expertise, but then I made it a little bit more fun than my academic books tend to be.
And as an American, how did you get interested in medieval manuscripts or medieval women?
Well, so that is a story about having a great teacher in college, which I think we can all relate to. For me, I knew I wanted to be an English professor and that I was really interested in going to graduate school, but I thought I was going to be a Victorianist. I loved Victorian literature. And I took the required Chaucer class as an undergraduate, and I thought that Chaucer was just fabulous and strange and weird and wonderful. And I was a women's studies minor, and there was just so much gender stuff to dive into with the Chaucer. So that when I applied for my PhD, I knew that I was focusing on medieval studies. And that was the entry point. And fortunately, because of funding I got in graduate school and funding as a professor, I've been able to do a lot of my research in England and spend a lot of time there and libraries and monasteries and all the places.
That's really cool. And do you teach about these subjects?
I do. I teach basically anything that's medieval or early modern. So I've taught up even to Milton's Paradise Lost. Prior to Bentley, I was at Marymount Manhattan College, and I was really the only faculty member who did anything from 1700 earlier. So that was kind of the wheelhouse. So I've taught courses on Chaucer, I've taught courses on medieval literature, medieval romance. I've taught classes on women's literature. Did all the Shakespeare courses, early modern literature. So that was all my area. Beowulf to Virginia Woolf, as they say, as the survey goes.
That's cool. So, what inspired you to switch over from academia to fiction?
So they're tied. I was actually going to a conference in London, and the conference got canceled because of a train strike when I was there. So I all of a sudden had a week, and usually if I'm in London, I'm doing research at the British Library, which I was doing while I was there. But they had these shortened hours because of the train strike. And I was talking to a friend about what books we wish existed from our periods of study. She was an Americanist who specializes in suffragists. And she had one of some lost letters that she wished had survived. And I said, oh, I always wished this book of visions by this nun, Elizabeth Barton, had survived because I knew a lot about her. And I had written a book about another visionary, Catherine of Siena, that had sort of culminated with some information about Elizabeth Barton. And I said it would make a great novel. And she said, well, why don't you write it? And I kind of laughed. And then I went back to my hotel room and started writing. And that it just flowed from there and came out. So it wasn't planned. I had so much fun doing it. And things worked out for me. I got an agent, I sold the book, and people are reading it. So
And it's in every bookstore that I've gone into, which is so fun to see someone who you know or follow actually on the shelf.
It's so exciting. It's been so exciting for me, and bookstores that I love have invited me to speak, and it really feels beyond anything I could have conjured up myself as a dream. It's been amazing.
Yeah, that's so exciting. I love when Tudor fiction meets the mainstream.
Yeah,
And especially when it's a newer author, because I love all the authors that, consistently put out a book every 6 months to a year, but it's always exciting when there's somebody breaking through.
I
So
agree. Yeah.
obviously the Tudor period is filled with tons of women who really were brave, and some of them had more agency than we really realized. What inspired you to choose Elizabeth Barton as your subject? And could you tell our listeners who she is?
Yes, yes, and it's not a spoiler for the book because you find this out right away. So Elizabeth Barton was a farm hand or a servant girl. It's not exactly clear what her role was, who had a series of religious visions that moved her out of that role into a convent, and she was championed by some pretty powerful men. So I talk a lot about in the book about Bishop Fisher. She was also championed by an Archbishop Warham, who's actually owned the land upon which the farm she worked at was. Thomas More, many of the names, important names from the Tudor period, because she was a kind of voice of Catholicism as a antidote to those Lutheran Protestant things that were happening, right? As we know, this is a really important moment in Tudor history, the break with the church. And she did have a book of visions that was printed, and we think there were maybe around 600 copies of them that existed at one point, but none survive. And the reason that none survive is because she also had a vision that Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn would go to hell and die very quickly should they marry. And she was very public about this vision. And knowing what you know and what I'm sure your listeners know about Henry VIII and how he would feel about that, Elizabeth was executed for treason. She was tried for treason and executed, and there are no copies of her books that survive because it was considered a heretical text to have, and they were likely all burned or destroyed. So half of my book is focuses on Elizabeth, and then half is a kind of modern day sort of closed door Agatha Christie murder mystery focused on an academic who finds a copy of her book, and there's some mysterious information inside.
Yes, and did the academic retreat that Dr. Allison, who's the character in the present timeline or 2023, were you kind of like drawing on your academic self to think of the academic retreat vibes?
Definitely, yes. So, not based on anybody I actually know, right? And I have not been at any conferences where there's been a murder or anything like a murder. But I have in our field, particularly, I think, because we're a kind of small, specialized field, we do have these small, specialized conferences. And I've been to quite a few that actually take place in English manor houses in England. And so that was sort of the inspiration for the modern day. What would it be like to be in one of these sort of manor house situations with a bunch of academics talking about Elizabeth? And then moving from there, I had the manor house be on the same grounds as her priory information, but really drawing on my expertise as an academic, but also the way I think historians and people who interact with history in any engaged way think about what it means to be in the same spaces where these historical events happened and how that feels and what kind of secrets a place can reveal that is a little different than just reading about something.
So, during the visit at the academic retreat, as you touched on, they were actually, without giving too much away, in a place that related to Elizabeth Barton. And you mentioned how interesting it is when academics are actually at the place of, the topic that they research on. Have you ever had that experience?
Yes, I definitely have. So my last academic book was on Catherine of Siena, And I did get to go to Siena, and you can see her house and the places where she had her visions. I mean, they're still sort of marked and they look probably exactly like they did in the 14th century. I mean, they really are unchanged. You can also see Catherine of Siena's head, which is on display at one of the cathedrals there as a relic, which is can be a little unnerving, but there is this it's a kind of uncanny feeling of meeting the past and having an encounter with something that you know really well, but you can't fully know because you can't be a 14th century person. You can't be an Elizabethan person. You can't be a Tudor person. You can only put clues together and try to construct what that might be like.
And you also talk about the excavation of older houses. And I really enjoy that because, especially, there's some items that we know existed at one point that we just hope for that shows
Mhm.
up, like Anne's letters to Henry. Back to that. Did you ever have an experience where you found something from the past?
I not that exciting. I definitely have friends who are archaeologists who found exciting things, and I've been sort of witness to exciting things in my lifetime. So the Staffordshire Hoard, which you might be familiar with, was uncovered when I was a professor, and it was the kind of thing I was teaching about. And then all of a sudden, it opened up an entire different understanding of Anglo-Saxon culture and textiles, all, really different things. So I was trying to capture a little bit of that feeling. And there are also texts that have been discovered in the 20th century that we didn't know still existed or thought that were lost. So there was an Arthurian text about Merlin that was recently discovered. There was the Book of Marjorie Kemp, which is a major women's text from the Middle Ages that was discovered in the 20th century. So it's not impossible. There are things that are out there and perhaps they're waiting to be found. Yeah.
It also reminded me of Anne Boleyn's Book of Hours
Mm,
because it said that women actually pass that down through the generations,
right.
which I always find incredible. I'm so happy that still exists, and I think it's at Hever now.
It is there. And that those things are really personal to the owner too, right? That they have these kinds of paintings that are directed to the owner. So a sense of who they are. That's another feeling that you get as a historian. I think when you look through, I do a lot of work with original manuscripts, and you can see people have practiced writing their name or underlined something, right? And I think that there's a little bit of that in Anne Boleyn's Psalter, right? That I think her name in her hand is inside. And recently, didn't they also find a ring that was commemorating the marriage of, I think of Catherine of Aragon and Henry, but they had that was like in a field, right? So these things are out there.
Yeah, and speaking of Catherine of Aragon, her relationship with Elizabeth Barton is kind of interesting because she chose to never see her, despite Catherine herself being a vehement Catholic.
Hmm.
Why do you think she didn't want to get involved with
Yeah, it's a really good
Elizabeth?
question. I mean, I think that Elizabeth was really exuberantly out there in a way that was probably not what Catherine was hoping to have on her side. Because the other person who's a little wary of her is Thomas More, and I see Thomas and Catherine as very aligned. Thomas does meet with her, but we have his letters to Cromwell when Thomas More is imprisoned before his own execution. And one of the accusations levied against Thomas More for his, again, the reason he's considered treasonous is that he supported Elizabeth Barton. And Thomas More writes Thomas Cromwell and says, well, I supported her, but I always told her to stay out of the king's affairs. And I'm so glad that you uncovered her as a charlatan. So I think there's a little bit of that was probably going on with Catherine too, that there was just Elizabeth was too much and possibly had the feeling that something was not potentially quite right or wouldn't be interpreted as quite right. about her. So yeah, she did. She refused to ever meet with her.
But she did have an audience with Henry, which I find almost shocking. What was that situation like?
She had two audiences with Henry, I understand. I don't know, right? This is all one of the interesting things about Elizabeth is that really the only records we have surviving are kind of hit jobs, for lack of a better word, because they were written by the Protestants and who really didn't like her. And the things that would have sort of framed her within Catholicism aren't surviving anymore, like her own book. I mean, we have some records otherwise, but nothing in her voice. So it's hard to tell. I think in the beginning, she aligned with Henry's own sense of himself and view of Catholicism, and he really was considered this defender of the church and believed himself to be quite a theologian and quite devout. And his alliance with Thomas More also plays all this out. And I think as that dissolved and Elizabeth didn't, change her tune, that's when things turned. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall in those meetings and her meeting with Wolsey and her meeting with Thomas More. I mean, these are all meetings that we know she had, right? So that was part of the imagination process, was to see what those would look like.
And those are major Tudor figures,
Right.
the cream of the crop. So that's why I feel like it is so unusual. But I can't help but see the fact that she may have been manipulated by many men this through her whole journey. I
Right.
feel like even if she was having those prophetic visions, the men were interpreting them for her. Do you think that that played a role in our perception of who she was?
I mean, I think so. That was definitely the accusation against her. And we do have the sermon that was preached at her trial, at her execution. And it specifically says she was misled by Dr. Bocking, who was her confessor, and was told what to say. Whether that's true or not, I tried to give her a little bit more agency than that. And I think there's kind of proof that she had more agency than that. But it is part of a question that kind of haunts all these medieval visionaries and circulates around them, because they were very important and they were very powerful, and a lot of men listened to them. However, their position was still really dependent on the men around them and how the church did or did not embrace them. I mean, you see this with Joan of Arc, right? With Bridget of Sweden. I mean, this is Catherine of Siena, who I study. This is a perennial issue. Men like having these women, their notoriety that they bring with them. They have a lot of power because they have these kinds of direct lines to the divine. And yet there's a line that they can't cross, or they're being shaped by the men. So I think both things are going on with Elizabeth. On the one hand, she would have had to have been pretty savvy to get as far as she did and to have those meetings. On the other hand, there were a lot of men who were really invested in what she was saying and who had a lot more power than she did. So,
And psychologically, does psychology play a role in having prophetic visions? Or because, I personally, I guess I'm agnostic, but I don't really know if I believe in visions, but I don't think she was a liar. So how do we grapple with that?
yeah, I was trying to thread that needle a little bit in the novel, you might see. It's a hard question, and I think partly because that's one of the things that we cannot place ourselves into that time period in a way that fully understands. And there are certainly scholars who try to see it from a lens of psychosis, or, how else can we describe really vivid imaginations that lead to it. And I think those are all possibilities. For me, and from the women I study, I've just had to kind of rely on the idea that this was a culture of faith, that they had faith that this was true, and that other people had faith that this was true. However, that being said, it was also always a question at the time whether women were telling the truth or not. And people were invested in that. And there were guidebooks for women, how they could tell whether their visions were divine or demonic, right? And the papacy would send investigators to see whether the women were true or not true. And I have a little bit of that happening with Elizabeth. So there are questions that we have, there are questions that medieval and Tudor people had, and there is no answer.
I couldn't help but think of Joan of Arc, as you
Yeah.
mentioned. I feel like there's a lot of similarities between them.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, you can draw a line from a lot of these visionaries to each other. And often the accusation is that they believe they're like the other one, right? I mean, Joan of Arc wouldn't have been a model for Elizabeth just because of the way that those texts circulated in England. But Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, these were women who were mentioned in the sermon as, oh, I think she read too much of those women, right? She got a little carried away, right? So it's exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, this is all happening during the Great Matter period and the Reformation. I kind of got a sense from the book that, and in history, that even religious houses were skeptical of, housing her as, and do you think that was a challenge for her during that time?
I think religious houses were skeptical of visionaries generally, right? In the same way that you've expressed skepticism. Yeah. That there was something really unknowable about what was happening to those women and in those women's minds. And did you really want it in your nicely well-governed house, right? And then there's some houses, there was a convent in Germany that was sort of had an explosion of women visionaries. There were tons of them, right? So some places kind of nurtured it and other places didn't. And I think during the Reformation, particularly, that wariness was just heightened, right? I mean, that's for religious people, religious meaning, that they were nuns or they were priests and in religious houses in England with this kind of looming threat, which we know ends in the dissolution of those houses and really turning people out of, for some of them, the only homes they've ever known and the only stability they've ever known, right? Was a really terrifying time. And to throw a visionary into it who becomes an enemy of the king is a wild card you might not want.
Yeah, the Tudor propaganda against her is that maybe initially she was giving interesting religious prophecies, but they believe it turned political
Right.
when, as you mentioned before, she had a vision that she said to Henry that if he married Anne Boleyn, they would burn in hell. Do you think that Anne Boleyn had any relationship with Elizabeth? Would she have heard that threat?
So there is, yes, she absolutely would have heard that threat. And I really could have gone a different place with the kinds of interactions that Anne had with Elizabeth and her mother. I mean, there are other things going on that I, for the sake of the novel, did not include. But we do know that the priest who gave her a sermon, the kind of hit job sermon, I like to think of it, on Elizabeth was hand selected by Anne, was her favorite speaker, and she wanted him to do it. So she certainly knew what was going on and was involved.
And Anne, have you ever read Heather Darcy's book, The Judicial Murder of Anne Boleyn?
No.
Okay, I'm gonna shout it out right now. It's a wonderful
I'll
book.
put it on my list.
One of the theories that Heather presented that I thought was interesting is that Anne was more involved with banned books than we give her credit for. She was a true reformer at that time. And do you think that's one of the reasons why Elizabeth kind of focused on Anne?
That's really interesting. And I believe it because I think that one of the real markers of the Reformation was bringing in the Bible in English, right? Which was banned, and Tyndale's Bible. I think that and really stood for that Protestant invasion in a particular way, which is what the focus was on, not so much on the remarriage of Henry as on what that meant religiously and the break with the church, right? And I think that's true. I think that was true for Elizabeth. I think that's what was true for Fisher. I think that's what was true for Thomas More. I feel like the marriage is just a sort of a byproduct of what was really troubling these men, which was the rupture with Rome and what that meant.
I agree. I really think it doesn't have as much to do with the marriage as we wish it did. Morally, I understand that because he abandoned Catherine of Aragon. So we kind of want there to be some divine punishment for that. But the more that I learn, I see it, as you said, differently. All of these men were kind of dealing with Henry's narcissism and as well sending so much money to the Pope.
Totally. The break with Rome was as much a financial decision as a religious one because the church was owned so many lands and was receiving so many rents from places throughout England that all of a sudden, I mean, this is what happens with the dissolution of the monasteries, right? Is that all that land is reclaimed by the throne and it's redistributed and the rents are now coming in, right? It was a huge financial boost for Henry. But I really think if the Pope had just granted the annulment, things might have been different for a while. I feel like it probably still would have, because of that kind of financial piece, would have maybe ended up where it ended up in the end. But it wouldn't have been so tied to the marriage in the way that it was because the Pope didn't grant the annulment because of their relationship with Spain, right? I mean, it's like those things are entangled, right? So,
Yeah, and I feel like I kind of, because I love the Tudor time period, I kind of have an English-centric idea of Europe at that time. But something that cracks me up is that they were dealing with a lot in Rome at that time, and they were not responding to Henry quickly about the great matter. I think we kind of think like he wrote to them, it was over. No, because they were dealing with the sack of Rome around the same time period. So I think it didn't go as fast as people might assume.
no, and far as who you're going to want to keep happy, you'd rather keep Spain happy than England if you were Italy, because that's adjacent, right? And bigger and has a lot more power in at that moment.
Yeah, and again, going back to kind of what I said about Catherine and Aragon wishing, I also don't think that Spain was as great as a champion about Catherine as we wish they were. Politics and discovery really probably played bigger roles into that. But as a feminist, I want to believe that Mary and Catherine were kind of protected by Spain. Do you think Spain played a role in any of the court politics?
Oh, yeah, I think they played a huge role. I really think the real conversation was a political financial conversation. Then there was a kind of religious conversation that was tied to that. Because, of course, the Vatican was also a political institution, right? Religion was almost subservient to the politics for them. And then the king and his love life was really the tertiary, although it's the best story for lots of reasons. So that's the one that's the story that you tell mostly. And there were real women whose real lives were very impacted by what was happening. And the people of England's lives were really impacted by what was happening. But there was a lot going on that was tied together. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe people don't realize it, but Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn and Catherine Parr, especially, and I'm sure Anne of Cleves, were all highly educated women. But Elizabeth came from a farm background.
Mhm.
How did she intellectually discuss things with the King of England?
Yeah. So that is something I thought about a lot and drew again on my academic research to be thinking about. She was almost certainly illiterate. So That's one factor. And if she had any literacy, it was probably in English and not in Latin, which is what these texts were written in, which Anne Boleyn would have had literacy in Latin, right? I mean, it's a different kind of literacy. And so I think a lot of it, to that extent, is what she was told and taught, right? And that it would have been very easy to give her talking points that she probably worked off of. And I again, I assume Elizabeth was a pretty smart woman to get where she did and how she did. I'm sure she was incorporating a lot from what she was hearing and listening, but that literacy gap would have been a big one.
Yeah, and that's kind of where you feel like the manipulation of the men supporting her was kind of coming in. So ultimately, Thomas Cromwell worked to bring her down. Do you think Thomas feared her at all and that's why he did it, or was she just a pawn in the way?
I I think they must have feared her in order to execute her, first of all, right? She was the only woman whose head was displayed on the bridge. Out of all of those executions, her head was the only woman's head. So that says something about at least what she symbolized, I think. And that's that more than fearing her, I think the fear of the symbol of what she represented. And this is one of the things just generally about visionary women is that they are described as having a kind of direct access to God, right? When they're speaking, it's not them, they're speaking God's words. So if you have a woman going around saying, Henry's going to hell, it's not that Elizabeth thinks that. She's saying, God has told me this, and I'm speaking it out. And there were certainly enough people who believed it that a trial claiming she was a charlatan, having her admit to lying publicly and then executing her and displaying her head, that there were reasons that she had to go, right, as far as the mechanics of what they were putting in place.
It's a story of a rise from poverty to the greatest rooms in the country. It's kind of, it is fascinating. And as we said, she's connected to so many famous figures from that time period. So I don't want to give anything away about the present timeline because that's really where the mystery is
Mhm.
going. But how did you decide to choose Dr. Allison and Elizabeth Barton to obviously combine them together into the book?
Yeah, well, so was interested, as I'm sure you and your listeners are, because I think that's why we're drawn to certain time periods anyway, about the ways in which the present reflect the past, right? And I think partly one way is that the Reformation was a time when people were really divided among themselves and the country was really split in two and you were on either one side or the other. And I think we're living in a time that's very similar to that. So that was one of the things that was interesting to me. And then I also think there's a feeling like, oh, we've come so far. Women don't have any problems anymore. The patriarchy is dead, right? And then we're living in a time where that is clearly not true. And there are a lot of legislations that hurt women. And we have people, trying to roll back women's rights in all sorts of ways. So I felt like having a modern day female protagonist helped reveal some of those similarities in a way and pressures on women, the way in which men do or don't manipulate women, how smart women get around things. So that was one of the reasons I really wanted to do that kind of juxtaposition. And then I'm as a historian, a literary historian myself, I love the process of uncovering and the process of interacting with history. So that was another way I really wanted to show that kind of back and forth. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of historical fiction is that you can fill the gaps, like the conversations that people had behind closed doors that
Yeah.
we really don't know what they're saying. But since you are an academic historian, was there anything about the past that you wanted to keep that you were like, it needs to stay this way regardless?
I mean, I definitely manipulated some things and I tried to stick pretty close to the timeline of Elizabeth's life and the years that she met with Henry or the years that she meets with him in the book or the years that she met with Wolsey, right? I kept those true. And I have some of the characters saying actual things, that we know that they said that are recorded. But I also took a lot of liberties. I cut out whole figures. I mentioned Archbishop Warham, who's a pretty major figure. I don't think he even gets mentioned in the book, right? I was trying to combat the tendency to make it not fiction. And I had to fight that tendency a lot, trying not to have any anachronisms, but I wasn't writing in Elizabethan English, right?
It must be nice to free yourself from like having footnotes
It was
and stuff like
very
that.
freaking, yeah.
Yeah, because it must be difficult being a dean of a college while you're working on, I'm sure, your academic
Yeah.
research and then also writing a novel. But was this a fun thing for you to
It was
do?
so fun. It was super fun. Every part of it was fun, even the revisions, which as an academic, revising academic work can be really difficult and laborious. This was just, oh, you want me to cut that? Okay. I don't have an argument I'm trying to prove, so I don't feel that something needs to be in there. And yes, the liberation from footnotes was so great. And the ability to play around with things. So I have when she goes to see Henry, I liked the later livery better than the livery that would have actually been worn at the time. So I just went with the later one because I felt like that was more a description I wanted to make. So I just, made changes like that.
Oh, that's a really cool detail. So, is there any hope for a sequel?
There is, I think. I'm working on another novel now that's completely a modern day mystery and is not historical fiction, and I'm about halfway through that, so I want to get through that one first. But I feel like Allison needs to come back for another story, and I have one sort of percolating in the back of my mind. So someday,
That's awesome. Yeah, it's totally set up for the story to continue. Maybe not Elizabeth's
yeah,
story,
I think
uh,
Elizabeth is.
or you could bring her to the present.
It's true. It's well, and there are really some wonderful Tudor fiction now. Is The Beheading Game. I don't know if you've read that recently, and we have Henry Tudor Must Die, which is about to come out, which both imagine Anne Boleyn surviving her execution. So never know with Elizabeth.
Exactly. And that would be so interesting for her to see any of those figures to come to the modern day. Well, that's really cool. So, where can our listeners find your work? Maybe even look up your academic work if that's published.
Yes, so I have a website. It's jennifer-brown.com, and it lists my academic writing as well as information about the novel. And the Lost Book of Elizabeth Barton really should be available anywhere that you buy books. And the Audible is quite good as well. It's not me, it's a trained actor reading it.
Yeah, I listened to the audiobook.
Yeah, she did a great job, I thought, with the different accents and everything. So
Yeah, and I rented the book from the library, and just so you know, it's only a 14-day loan.
oh, well,
So that means it's hot off the shelf. Yeah, because
hot off the
usually it's
shelf.
21 days.
Yeah, yeah.
So people could
Um,
not wait.
well, I hope you were able to read it in 14 days. That seems quick.
Well, I renewed
Yeah.
it. Actually, no, I think I read this in 4 days along with the
Oh, wow.
audiobook. Yeah, I like to do it right before the interview
Yeah.
because I'm a procrastinator. And then it stays fresh in my mind.
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
idea.
And I always ask, is there any book? I guess you just did recommend two books, but is there a Tudor historical fiction book that kind of changed your life that you would recommend?
I actually haven't read Henry Tudor Must Die yet. I think it comes out today, so it's on my to-do list. But I loved The Beheading Game and I highly recommend it. Author is Rebecca Lehman. And it was so much fun and I particularly, she's also a good sticks to Tudor England. It feels authentic, and she also plays with Arthurian legends. So it's got a bunch of Easter eggs for medievalists who specialize in Arthurian literature. So I would highly recommend that. I loved all of the Philippa Gregory books, and I think there really are such wonderful novels out there that imagine. I love The Other Boleyn Girl. I mean, they're really, I think it's a time period that is asking for the women's stories to be told, and a lot of authors have done really excellent jobs doing that.
Exactly. I totally agree. And I also think that this wasn't on purpose, listeners, but every author slash historian that I've spoken to are women.
Oh, really interesting.
Yeah, so I feel like when I imagine stuffy Oxford men, doing history, I've been in
Right.
this field, it's like all women, so I'm loving it.
That's great. Yeah. Well, we're probably the ones most likely to be talking about women's history too.
Exactly. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me. It's been fantastic to finally get to speak to you.
So much fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thanks for listening to the History with Ali podcast. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and Spotify at History with Ali. See you next time.